It'll take me a minute to get going. Okay, here we are. So, hi, this is Metta Spencer, and I'm in Toronto with a friend of mine who's in Mexico City. He's an old friend. His name is Tovish, and he's old in two senses of the word. We both met when we were much younger, and I met Aaron, I think it was about 1982 or 83, when I was in Dubrovnik, and he was hitchhiking around Europe trying to sell people on the idea of third-party intervention, if I'm not mistaken. And I think he often slept out of doors in his sleeping bag, and we got acquainted in Dubrovnik. So it's been a long time. Here we are with both of us with silver hair, and he has retired. But oh, look at this. He's got his cat on his shoulder. Say hello, Aaron, so we can show your cat to the world.
Hello, folks.
And that's Susie. Is that Susie? Okay. So, hi, Aaron. It's so wonderful to see you again and to be back in touch with a partner in our long-term struggle for nuclear disarmament. So, we met in Dubrovnik, and you were a young man from Brookline, Massachusetts. Is that right?
That's correct.
And you'd studied at MIT, had you? And were you a linguistics student in those days?
No, but I knew Noam Chomsky.
Lots of people know.
He and I led a student strike at MIT against the war in Vietnam, and in particular against the war research that was being done at some of the labs that were directly under the supervision of MIT. The upshot of that was MIT severed all of its contacts with those laboratories. Sort of a partial victory. Would have preferred to shut down the laboratories completely, but at least we upheld certain standards of scholarly independence by making it clear that war research had no place in a university.
Okay. Well, good. Bravo. That's wonderful. Okay. So now let me think. When we met in Dubrovnik, you were, I think, officially supposed to be living in Sweden, right? And your connection, at least you'd spent some time in Sweden, because I remember we talked a little bit about it. And your connection to Sweden has certainly solidified over the years. Because as I understand it now, you are living in Mexico City, you say, because you are the spouse of the Swedish ambassador to Mexico. Annika, what is Annika's last name?
Annika Thunborg.
Okay. She and I have never been introduced yet, so maybe if she strolls through the background with your cat, we can say hello. Anyway, that is wonderful. Now let's look at your the interval, because you've had some extremely interesting periods in your career. I remember going to see you a lot in New York when you were the director or something of Parliamentarians Global Action, right?
Yep.
What was that organization, and does it still exist? I haven't heard about them lately.
Yeah. I was first what's the title exactly? I was head of research on security issues for Parliamentarians for Global Action. And then I became director of the programs, and then ultimately I was acting Secretary General. But at that point, there was a transition from disarmament issues to more towards democracy and development issues. And I was already thinking of other fields of action. But we did some really interesting work. The name of the organization was Parliamentarians for Global Action. And what we did, we had a membership in over 100 countries of people who were currently serving in their national legislatures. and many of them were members of foreign affairs or defense committees and were pretty well versed on some of the issues, but benefited by joining the organization because it provided a more global view. And there were experts like me and other people that we involved who could take issues even more deeply in terms of strategy and so forth. And I was brought on board by a New Zealander who was the Secretary General of the organization at that time, named Nick Dunlop. And because I was working on this project called Third Party Intervention, where I was, as you mentioned, traveling around Europe, talking to activists and foreign ministry officials in the neutral and non-aligned countries of Europe. Parliamentarians for Global Action had a global scope. And so that idea, they needed help with that. And I was working on this, and next thing I knew, I was working on a global approach to that issue, which ultimately led to visits by parliamentarians to about 10, maybe 12 countries. And in most cases, they were able to meet at the head of government level and get a commitment from some of them to form a group to overcome the impasse that existed at that time in the arms control field. All negotiations between the United States and Russia had broken down. Sound familiar? And the idea was that a more neutral group could put forward ideas without being suspected of trying to advance its own interests at the detriment of the other side's interests. Ultimately, 6 heads of government agreed to be involved in that initiative. And they worked together for 5 years. And by the end of those 5 years, not only were the nuclear weapon states talking to each other, they actually were agreeing on things like the Intermediate Range Nuclear Forces Treaty. Let
me ask you about this amendment conference, because I'm not quite clear what the connection was. The most exciting thing I remember was the time when I went to see you and you were telling me about having discovered some sort of loophole in one of the treaties that might be exploited. Now, was that in your capacity as organizer of the Six Nations Peace Initiative, or just Parliamentarians for Global Action, or just for Aaron Tovish? And tell me about that amendment conference, because that was really, it was a really dynamite experience.
Yeah. The Six Nation leaders seized on the moratorium that Gorbachev called on nuclear testing and said, okay, that's very nice. Now let's verify it. And they said, we're prepared to go into, send scientists into the Russian test site area and into the US test site areas and ensure that, in fact, these moratoria are being honored with the aim of getting negotiations going. Reagan was not responding to Gorbachev. And on that line, what happened was the Natural Resources Defense Council, a US-based, largely scientific group, they offered to go into the Russian test site, and the Russian Soviet Academy agreed to go to the US, around the US test site. And after a couple of years, with some facilitation from Parliamentarians for Global Action, that actually happened. So that addressed, in large part, the questions of the verification of the test ban, but it didn't get negotiations going. And it was in preparation for one of the Non-Proliferation Treaty Review conferences that I did some historical studies and discovered that its amendment provisions were drawn from the Partial Test Ban Treaty of 1963.
When you were looking at what and before you...
They basically, in the negotiations of the Non-Proliferation Treaty, they needed a provision for amending the treaty, and basically drew on the procedure that was in an earlier treaty, the Partial Test Ban Treaty, which banned testing in the atmosphere. And at that point, a light bulb went off, and I said, the NPT is all well and good, but let's focus on what we could do within the Partial Test Ban Treaty, which is sometimes called the Limited Test Ban Treaty.
To make it into a comprehensive test ban.
Exactly. How could you propose an amendment that would, at the very least, force a discussion on the international stage of banning all testing?
Mm-hmm.
That idea was a bit of a stretch for the Six Nation group. For example, Greece was a member of the Six Nation Initiative, and they were a member of NATO, and it was a little hard for them to take that course. So we pulled together a new group of six. And there, the Mexican ambassador, who we've been working very closely with in the Six Nation Initiative, he was the Nobel Prize winner, Alfonso Garcia Robles. He took the lead with that in Geneva, and what we did is we mobilized a whole contingent of the American diplomats who had negotiated the Partial Test Ban Treaty and who basically said, yes, the amendment provision is in there to allow the parties to make the treaty comprehensive. So go for it. So that was sort of like a seal of approval, which made it much easier to promote. There were a couple of, actually 3 UN resolutions, one year after another, sort of building up support and courage to go ahead and do this completely unprecedented thing of non-nuclear weapon states using a treaty and negotiated by nuclear weapon states to put nuclear weapon states on the spot about the fact that practically 25 years had elapsed and we were still only banning testing underground. Indeed, actually, on the 25th anniversary of the treaty, the ambassadors in Geneva took the amendment and delivered it to the 3 nuclear weapon states that negotiated the treaty, the United Kingdom, the United States, and Russia. Though their ambassadors were shocked that this was actually happening, but it was. And over the course of about half a year, we had to get a third of the states' parties to say, yeah, we want to discuss this amendment. And one of the key things there was when a young Canadian who worked with us, I don't know if you remember Maxime Faye.
I do indeed. He's still, I think he's a Facebook friend, although we don't have a lot of contact.
Yeah.
Good for Maxime.
He's working on Indigenous rights these days.
You're still in touch.
He went on a trip to India, met with folks in the foreign ministry there, and India came on board requesting the amendment conference be convened, and then shortly after that, we went over the top. But again, it was we had worked with India in the Six Nation Peace Initiatives, so we had really good access, and it made a huge difference. At that point, the nuclear weapon states were squirming and trying to delay things and so forth. I shouldn't say all of them. Gorbachev was very supportive. Ultimately, the conference was scheduled for January 1991, and we had a trilateral, we called it trilateral delegation of parliamentarians. We visited Moscow and met with Gorbachev, who was very supportive. We went on to London and met, we arrived there just on the day before Thatcher finally resigned.
Yeah.
And so we weren't able to meet the foreign minister, or Thatcher for that matter, but we met with the deputy foreign minister, and then we went on to the White House and met with Brent Scowcroft.
All right.
And I think at that point, the nuclear weapon states realized this was really happening, and they had to figure out how to deal with it.
And they couldn't block it.
What's that?
They couldn't prevent it. They couldn't say no.
They were under a clear treaty obligation. It was their responsibility to convene the conference that at least two of them would have much preferred to avoid.
Yeah.
And again, we worked very closely with scientists to put together a very thorough protocol on verifying the amendment to ban and verify that there was no testing in the atmosphere or in the oceans or in outer space. So the conference was held at the same time that the first Gulf War was breaking out in January 1991. And it was quite extraordinary, I think, that the president of the conference, the foreign minister of Indonesia, Ali Alatas, whose country has the largest Muslim population in the whole world, he stuck it out as the president of that conference for the whole 2 weeks. And at the end of the conference, there was no question of adopting the amendment because in the provisions of the treaty, the original parties had veto power over it. But what was done was that the conference, by a vote of over 100 countries, empowered him to reconvene the conference whenever he felt there was a better chance of moving forward to adoption of the treaty. Shortly after that, Clinton was elected, having campaigned on the idea of banning testing. As often happens, people get into power and all sorts of forces start to work on them. And it looked as if the US was backing away from a comprehensive ban towards a threshold treaty, which would have allowed some testing underground at lower yields. But at that point, with our urging of Parliamentarians for Global Action, Foreign Minister Alatas said, okay, let's bring the parties back together. We need to talk about this. A 3-day meeting was scheduled for New York at the UN. And on the first day of the meeting, before it convened, further east in Geneva, the U.S. Agreed to start negotiations on a comprehensive test ban. Mm-hmm. At which point, when this news reached us in New York, Alatas said, mission accomplished.
Yeah. Great. Okay, so in a way, you can claim credit for the CTP.
A little, yeah. I like to say that there are probably 100 key people that worked on achieving ban. And I probably fit it up there and among the 100 who it happened.
Absolutely. I'll push you up toward the top. That's where you stand in my estimation. And of course, in a way, there is a CTP, although it hasn't been ratified by the US, I gather, and yet everybody's more or less observing it in my understanding.
Certainly all the parties that signed it, which is now way up over 150 countries, they are not only observing it, they've welcomed the test ban organization to set up seismometers and other detectors on their territory. So there's this huge verification network, which has other applications as well. Which simply didn't exist before the treaty, and which is functioning even though the treaty has not formally entered into force. It also made it possible that when India and Pakistan tested, they were isolated in the international community because the Comprehensive Test Ban Treaty had been in force for a couple of years. Had been negotiated already a couple of years earlier. And then now, of course, with North Korea, um, the U.S. Is hypocritical, I'm afraid to say, about many things, but on the testing issue, even though they haven't ratified the treaty, they have put a lot of money into the verification system and have played a relatively positive role, short of ratification. So the treaty has served a purpose, is serving a purpose, and when it does ultimately enter into force, it'll be a key part of the overall regime against nuclear weapons.
Well, that's where we need to look at the next steps. You know, what is beyond the cessation of testing? Let's look at the movement toward abolition, banning of not only possession and, of course, use. I guess.
Yeah.
So there have been a lot of moves. Now, let me ask you this. We started off looking at your career trajectory, and without having your CV in front of me, I do remember that most of the work you've been doing over the last 10 years or more, 20, has been for the organization called Mayors for Peace, right? And
yeah.
Tell me about their role in this kind of initiative, the move toward abolishing nuclear weapons.
Yeah. Well, Mayors for Peace was launched by the mayors of Hiroshima and Nagasaki back in the 1990s. Over the course of 10 or more years, they had gathered together about 500 cities. But in around 2000, the mayor of the current mayor of Hiroshima, Tatoshi Akiba, he thought there really should be a lot more that this organization can do other than hold meetings every once in a while. And he had been a parliamentarian, and he had worked with parliamentarians for global action and with me. He attended an NPT review conference in Geneva, where I was living at that time. And it so happened that we were both speakers at that conference, one after the other. And after I sat down, or after I finished my presentation to the review conference, Tad grabbed me by the arm and said, "Aaron, I need you to work with me."
Oh. Yeah.
And that is what I did for the next 13 years, but also the mayor who followed him. So the question then was, well, what could we do with this organization? And the first thing was clearly that the membership would be much, much larger. At that time, I think there were a lot of countries where no cities were members and so on. And so in the course of the next few years, to the amazement of the Japanese staff, because they just didn't think it was possible, actually within 1 year, we doubled the membership. 1,000, and over the next few years, we brought it up to 5,000, and it's now approaching 8,000 cities. That's a lot of cities, and a lot of major cities are members. So by the time I resigned 2 years ago, we could say that well over 1 billion people were represented by the organization through their elected mayor. So what do you do with that kind of, clout? And the position we had was that there needs to be negotiations on the elimination of nuclear weapons. And just as you've eliminated or almost eliminated chemical weapons and you've prohibited biological weapons, it's time to do the same with the most deadly weapon of mass destruction, nuclear weapons. And we tried various approaches to get diplomats mobilized to do this, held several meetings at the UN, attended by dozens and dozens of countries. And ultimately, it took a failure of an NPT review conference, the one in 2005, to get some serious discussion going in Geneva, where the Conference on Disarmament had been deadlocked for almost a decade, that they needed another venue to move these issues forward. And I put forward to the Mexicans, again, that there should be an ad hoc working group established by the General Assembly to meet in Geneva and make use of all of the diplomatic expertise that was there for the Conference of Disarmament, but was idle in terms of any kind of serious work. Mexico, with my help, gathered together a good group of diplomats, including Canada. Paul Meyer was the ambassador to the Conference on Disarmament at the time from Canada. He hosted some of the meetings where these plans were hatched. Mm-hmm. And the group went to the General Assembly and held a meeting where they described what their plans were. And at that point, the Americans started to pay attention, unfortunately. And also at that point, a new government took power in Canada. And the story I've heard, I can't document it.
About the Harper government?
Yes, exactly.
Yeah. Okay.
The story I heard was that Condoleezza Rice called the new foreign minister and said, "Are you aware of what your ambassador in Geneva is doing?" And he said, we don't look kindly on this. And, we have a lot of issues under discussion with you, forestry, borders, whatever. Mm-hmm. And, if you push us around like that, don't expect us to be gentle either. At which point the foreign minister called up Paul Meyer. You might get him on to talk about this. But I think it was a very painful moment for him. He was told, "Don't you say another word about this."
Was it John Baird or who? The Canadian foreign minister at the time?
I don't remember.
Okay.
I'm not that good at names, especially if I haven't met someone. But he wasn't banned from attending the meetings. So he was. So in solidarity with all these folks he had helped mobilize, he attended the meetings, but all of the talking, or 90% of the talking, was left to the Mexican ambassador, Luis Alfonso de Alba. And so...
was this a small group, or what kind of this a working group of what, 20 countries?
About 10 countries. There are about 10 countries involved, co-sponsoring the resolution. In the end, the resolution that year, the resolution was withdrawn. There was sort of a face-saving option of empowering, of allowing a single country to chair a way of having usually there are 3 different countries that chair the Conference on Disarmament each year. And what was decided was that they would decide that they would call on those chairs to form a group and work together as a team throughout the year. And that this was thought might allow for a breakthrough at the Conference on Disarmament. Well, in fact, it didn't. And it was 5 years later that finally, in this instance, it was the Austrians who took the initiative with their ambassador, Alexander Kment, to revive the idea of an ad hoc working group. So I worked closely with him, with Reaching Critical Will, and ultimately a fairly large group of countries. And at the General Assembly, in fact, the ad hoc working group was established. Running along at the same time as that, there was the founding of the International Campaign Against Nuclear Weapons. Mm-hmm. Kiba attended the IPPNW's international conference in Helsinki. I was there with him. was there that the Australians put forward this proposal. Kiba was asked to speak, in favor of it. He did. And then in Vienna, where I was living at that time, during one of the NPT preparatory meetings, this initiative was formally launched, and Mayors for Peace was among the initial.
How did this open-ended working group come about? Was that a separate initiative, or did?
Well, it was a previous initiative, as I've described. This was happening on parallel lines. The working group was established not at the initiative of ICANN, because ICANN didn't exist at that time. But once it started meeting, and ICANN had taken the humanitarian conferences, there were 3 conferences held in Norway, Mexico, and Austria. Those 3 conferences sort of reached the point where, yes, something should be done to prohibit nuclear weapons. They called it filling the legal gap, that nuclear weapons weren't under the same kind of prohibition as chemical and biological. And so the question was then, okay, you've got all these countries agreeing to do something. What method are they going to use? What vehicle are they going to use? And that's when they said, oh, the ad hoc working group, let's use that. And so the whole ICANN effort then became funneled into the ad hoc working group, which Mayors for Peace had played a key role in creating.
Okay.
So glad to see that. Fairly shortly after that, the ad hoc working group decided by a vote, because that was one of the differences. The Conference on Disarmament required consensus, which meant everything was easily blocked by someone, usually the United States, but in other cases, Pakistan, who knows. And so the ad hoc working group avoided that by taking a vote and saying the UN should establish a negotiating body to prohibit nuclear weapons. This was opposed by most of the nuclear weapon states, but it went ahead. And so it was 2 sessions were scheduled, I think one in April and the other in July. Maybe it was May and July. Dates aren't that critical. At any rate, the parties worked really, really hard to actually conclude a treaty in July 2016.
Now, let me interrupt you because I'm a little confused myself. I attended. I think it was the last time I saw you. We met, I believe, in Stockholm, because I was in Geneva for 2 things. One was the open-ended working group, and that was also the Green Cross International anniversary, where I had a chance to meet Gorbachev. And that was a lovely event. But then I went on to Stockholm, and that's where I saw you last. But that all I know is that I did attend for 1 or 2 days this very boring meeting. I don't know how you diplomats and your wife managed to endure these horrible meetings of boring meetings. But at any rate, the open-ended working group was having a meeting at the UN in Geneva. Now there was an interval at least 2 years after that before the 2 consecutive open-ended working groups met again, to which you're now referring. So I know that I went to one that I don't think it bombed, but nothing much came of it right away. And there was at least a couple of years in between. And then now you're picking it up. You've just talked about the ones that really amounted to something, I think. Yeah. What year would that have been, and how did the first one get started? And did the first open-ended working group instigate or have any power to get to make another meeting happen? Sounds like it was ICANN that was pushing the energy of the
Yeah.
in working groups from then on.
Basically, what we had done is create a vessel, a vehicle. But the question of where it would go wasn't clearly identified at the beginning. It was ICANN that provided the impetus to use this vehicle to drive the UN General Assembly to take a decision to call a negotiating conference for the prohibition of nuclear weapons. So if that vehicle hadn't been there, then they might have been able to create another one, and they might have been able to succeed, but it was very convenient, and this was our hope, that once we had created a vehicle, it would then find the proper purpose and actually do what the other negotiating forums were failing to do.
Well, okay, now it has succeeded in a way because you have this ban treaty, this treaty on the prohibition of nuclear weapons, which is the result of all of this chain of events that you've been recounting. It's a wonderful aspirational. I don't want to call it a vehicle, a treaty. If it were implemented, we'd be home free. We'd have everything accomplished, right? But let me switch gears, because what I'm hearing when we started our conversation before we started recording it, you were telling me about the effort that you are now engaged in to promote, I think, a much simpler level of international law, international practice anyway, which is to get agreement to prohibit first use of nuclear weapons. Obviously, that's a way lower step than banning and abolishing all existing nuclear weapons and never allowing any to exist again. So the gap, I'm a little fascinated by the gap between this extremely ambitious goal of actually getting the whole world to abolish nuclear weapons by signing on to and getting, of course, the nuclear weapon states to agree to the TPNW. The gap between that and this much more modest ambition that you seem to be going for, which is simply to clarify what actual nuclear weapon states are committed to doing and what they're not committed to doing, and the fact that they won't even promise to do no first use. That's, the gap is what amazes me. Can you explain how you can live with such a cognitive dissonance?
Sure. When I can, or more accurately, when the government started to meet to talk about what kind of treaty they wanted to create, I had some advice, and basically as I saw it, there were two things they could do. They could either go for a simple, clean prohibition on nuclear weapons, or they could create a somewhat more complicated treaty which allowed states to buy into different aspects of the prohibition on the way to ultimately adopting all aspects of the prohibition. So that it would be there would be more sort of hooks around which activists, particularly in the nuclear weapon states, would be able to press for progress short of the whole caboodle. What we found, and this was easily predicted, and I think those who went for the pure ban were aware of this, is that the nuclear weapon states would say nothing doing. We're going to have no part of this. Mm-hmm. And that indeed what has happened, and it's been reiterated at every opportunity by all of the nuclear weapon states except perhaps India and North Korea. North Korea hasn't had much to say about it because it's had other, fires to put out itself.
What does India say on this?
India has sort of said, well, we're sympathetic with it, but the time's not right. And look at what the other nuclear weapon states are saying. So, we're the good guys, leave us alone, go bother those folks. So what I was basically what I was saying, I called it, let's create a halfway house where states that are entangled in nuclear weapons, that have become in some sense addicted to nuclear weapons, can come partway towards our ultimate objective, and be part of a larger framework. They're basically this idea was recognized as interesting, as useful, but in the period of time that they had allotted themselves to negotiate this treaty, and the sense that they had to strike while the iron was hot, they went for the pure ban, understanding that the consequences would be that it could be quite a long time before any country that was reliant on nuclear weapons would join the treaty. What they have accomplished, and which is very important, is they've set a very high standard. They've made it very clear that we're no longer going to say that it's okay to postpone nuclear disarmament. The world really needs to get rid of these weapons as soon as possible. And if people are serious about it, we've created a method for them to show that they're serious about it. And this does create pressure on the nuclear weapon states. What it doesn't do, and which I think a slightly different treaty would have done, is that it doesn't provide a specific or a set of possible objectives that folks within the nuclear weapon states can say, aha, that's something that we can get our government to do soon. That's something we can get our government to do even if we can't get them to go all the way right away.
I see. Mm-hmm. Okay.
Now,
so there are no intermediate steps in the ban treaty. You're in or you're out.
Exactly.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. There's a certain period of time allowed for actually eliminating your nuclear weapons. Mm-hmm. But you've made the commitment to do that under verification and so forth. There's also no method for coordinating the involvement of all of the nuclear weapon states in coming into alignment with the treaty. It's sort of one.
Tell me how the ICANN people view this. If you were talking about promoting no first use, do they think that that you are undermining the big effort that is needed to be committed to the whole shebang, or do they accept that baby steps are better than nothing?
Well, first of all, let's be clear. I'm not in favor of a step-by-step approach at all.
Okay.
When I focus on what you and most other people call no first use, first of all, I don't call it that. I call it renouncing the option of initiating nuclear warfare.
Why do you avoid the
What's the difference? Because when you say first, the immediate thing you hear in your mind is second. And if you're just prohibiting first use, doesn't it imply that you're okay with second use?
Oh, I see what you mean.
Yeah. And ICANN is not okay with that. I'm not okay with that. And many others are not okay with that. If you pose it in terms of renouncing the option or renouncing even threatening first use, then you're more clearly silent on what about second use.
I see. Mm-hmm.
And this allows for cooperation between those who think that deterrence will need to operate until the very last steps of elimination are taken, and those who think that deterrence should be abandoned immediately. We can work together on saying that no one should start nuclear war. Nuclear war should not be started, period. And that, I think, is a position around which 90% of the publics of almost every country would be in full agreement with. There are certain areas where the public might be a smaller majority than that. So when I focus on this, I see it as the sine qua non of getting to a nuclear weapon-free world, and the only major sine qua non of getting to it. In other words, it's a two-step. It's not a step by step by step by step by step. It is a key step, and then the next step is nuclear disarmament. Mm-hmm. So it's a sort of a one-pace process. Why do I think this? Because as long as nuclear weapon states feel that their nuclear weapons are useful in addressing a conventional threat, for which they would, have to initiate, have to use nuclear weapons, even though no one else has used them, they are not ready to live in a nuclear weapon-free world. Even if every other country in the world was ready to renounce nuclear weapons, they would say, wait a minute, we have these nuclear weapons not to deal with those other guys' nuclear weapons. Well, partly to deal with those, but also to deal with this conventional threat. And therefore, we're holding on to them. Until a country says, I only have these weapons because other people have them, you have a problem. But when they say, I only have them because other people have them, well, if the other people are willing to get rid of them, if everyone gets rid of them, well, then what's the problem? So it really is, I use some biblical imagery sometimes because because people are familiar with it, not because I'm a preacher or anything like that. But we're living in the shadow of the valley of death, King James version of the Bible. Beautiful phrase, the valley of the shadow of death. Suits our situation perfectly. We have this mushroom cloud casting a shadow across our future. The nuclear weapon-free world we could think of as the promised land, a land where we are not threatened with the kind of devastation that nuclear war would inflict on all of humanity and the ecosystem, etc. The question is, how do you get from A to B? If you think of the valley separated by a mountain chain, clearly, if you're being strategic, you try to find the lowest pass through the mountains. And you try to get up to that pass, and then once you're up there, hopefully it's a pretty smooth sailing down into the promised land. And in my analysis, this issue of initiating nuclear warfare is what we have to do to get to the pass. If we can get all of the major countries, not necessarily every nuclear weapon states, but all of the major ones, to say, we are never going to start a nuclear war. That is completely out. And China and India have been saying that from the day they got nuclear weapons. We're never going to start a nuclear war. So, for example, there was a border crisis recently between China and India up in the Himalayas. nobody was worried about it becoming a nuclear confrontation because both of them have made it very clear they would never start such a confrontation. So a conflict remains a conventional conflict that's more easily resolvable. So if this analysis is right, my hope is that those who support the Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons will understand that this is an issue that needs to be raised in the nuclear weapon states and among their allies who rely on the nuclear power of the nuclear weapon states.
And it's not as hopeless as, I mean, even they will admit right now there's no chance of getting, say, the U.S. to agree to the TPNW or Russia, right?
Yeah.
But they might, as I understand it, wasn't it true that Obama wanted to go for a no first use commitment at temporarily, and I think he was talked out of it, and I'd be very interested in knowing what kinds of arguments were used to dissuade people on his team from promoting that. Do you know?
Yeah, we could go into the history of that. What I'm aiming for, let me get this out there first before we go into the specifics of this or that country. What I'm aiming for is to develop an international network of activists and experts and politicians who can appreciate this analysis. Many already do, but what the problem is, they're working in isolation from each other. You have this being raised in the parliament in Japan. You have it being raised by the Green Party in Germany. You have it being raised in Australia by the Labour Party. You have it being raised in the U.S. By Obama, but also now by the new chairman of the Defense Committee, Adam Smith, in the House.
Oh, good. Yeah, I didn't know that. All right.
Now, another thing is there is one of the main groups supporting the TPNW in the United States is also calling for no first use.
Who's that?
It's called Back from the Brink.
Oh.
And also Physicians for Social Responsibility are part of it. So there's a lot of appreciation of this, but what we've seen historically is that it tends to get raised by one country at a time when it's not being discussed by other countries. And so it makes it very hard to make progress. Mm-hmm. It's raised somewhere else. And again, it's in isolation and it doesn't make progress. But by getting a network together, we can coordinate those efforts better. We can learn from each other, and we can hopefully move this more towards center stage.
Now, I didn't even know that you were working on trying to organize a network of countries that would support if you don't use the word no first use, you have to have a shorter version than this other thing you gave me.
I call it.
At any rate, it sounds like a project, and I hadn't realized that you were into that kind of organizing work anymore.
At the early stages, at the very early stages.
Are you doing this through your new organization, Zona Libre, or some other way?
Zona Libre is on board with this. We have a working group in the Abolition 2000 Coalition called the Nuclear Risk Reduction Working Group. And this is going to be a key project of that group in the coming years, over the coming years. Okay. So you will be hearing a lot more about this as we move along. Now, I want to address the point that you raised about whether this could be viewed as a distraction from the effort to bring the TPNW into force, which requires 50 countries ratifying that treaty. and also in shaming the nuclear weapon states into, well, signing the treaty. That's a long shot, but in some way getting them to modify their behavior. Just the way, for example, the United States has not signed the landmines treaty, but in fact, it's stopped all export of landmines, and it's greatly reduced the production of landmines and greatly reduced the deployment of landmines. So even though they haven't signed, it has affected their behavior. Well, it's a little more complicated with nuclear weapons because with the NPT, we've already got no export. In several countries, there is no production of nuclear weapons going on. Unfortunately, that's starting to change.
Who are you thinking of as starting to produce them? You're talking about Korea or?
Well, the U.S. is, these modernization programs.
I see what you mean, yeah.
Increase the numbers, but they increase the capabilities of the weapons. Although, in the grand scope of things, the weapons are already so-called capable that these modifications would not really change the face of a nuclear war very much. Experts like to argue about that, but I think it's, again, what I'm thinking is, pointing out is that we need to shift the focus from the weapons to what is the policy about using the weapons.
Okay.
If you shift that policy, then you don't get quite so worked up over the numbers or the specific types of weapons, but more over why do they want the weapons? What do they want the weapons for? How are they using the weapons?
I don't want to disagree with you, but of course it would be bad to overlook the possibility of accidental use or all kinds of other unintended, unplanned for, non-policy guided use of nuclear weapons.
Well, that's true. But let me point out that you have friends within the nuclear establishments who definitely do not want to see them used without authorization, who definitely don't want to see them used by accident. They have put a lot of effort into that. And so far, while there have been some scary moments, their efforts have at least prevented the detonation of a nuclear weapon since not counting.
Well, you might as well cross your fingers and hope that that's what did it. We don't know.
Well, it certainly played something of a role.
Yeah, I shouldn't draw you off course because certainly the policy is the heart of the matter. And once you get the policy, then you can make more steps. I agree. Yeah. Anyway, sorry.
Yeah. So we have this message that we're trying to get out that there's not a contradiction between the Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons and this renunciation of initiating nuclear war, but that in fact they both need each other. Now, if it's a sine qua non, then it's obvious you need it in order to reach a nuclear weapon-free world that the TPNW talks about. So that's obvious. But why is it obvious that not initiating nuclear war needs the objective of a nuclear weapon-free world? Some people say, oh, if you can get rid of first use, then deterrence is perfect, and we just rely on it forever. But that's a very naive view of world politics. Quite apart from the thing we were just saying, and in fact, there can be unintended uses. Go on. That as well, but also sometimes countries elect leaders who have different ideas. Mm-hmm. I won't mention any names right now. But the point is, when you're up on that pass, there are two downhill directions. One is back into the valley of the shadow of the death. The other is onto the. If you don't make that commitment to keep going, you're reporting that you're going to backslide when there are other developments that occur. One of the things I find so fascinating is that those who believe in first use are constantly looking for some little sign that India and China are backsliding into first use.
Mhm.
They jump on any little paper or any little statement, and aha, they're going to be. And why are they so? Well, first of all, because India's policy and China's policy raises a question of why can't they also accept no first use?
Mhm.
Um, and they would be much more comfortable if nobody had first use. Also, because it locks you in. You're locked in the valley of the shadow of death if you can't get up to that pass
Mhm.
and the other side. So over and over, you see articles saying, aha, China has abandoned no first use. And then China comes out with a statement clarifying that absolutely not. There is no circumstances under which we'll use nuclear weapons first. And likewise with India. But there is the danger that China and India will backslide. And part of this effort is going to be encouraging them not only to hold firm on their position, but also for them to exert leadership on this and to raise this seriously with the other nuclear weapon states, saying, look, we are able to deal with our security without having nuclear weapons to deal with conventional threats. What's your problem? Why can't you do this also? And look at how, by having a first use, how you create insecurity and instability for everybody, the whole world. So that it would be an important part of this campaign to get people up to the valley and to keep them from backsliding and to help move them forward.
All right. Well, I can join your group then, whatever. Sounds like you're
welcome. Most welcome.
In fact, if I can ask you, either write it yourself or if you get somebody to write a position paper for Peace Magazine, I would love to have it on this very thing that we've talked about. And I'm sure with this burgeoning network that you're organizing, you'll find somebody who will do such a thing, right? Can I get you on record as that?
But one of the first tasks in each country, and this gets us back to the specific cases, is to find out what has been the history of rejecting first use in the countries that don't yet have it. What has been the problem? What have been the arguments?
Mm-hmm.
What are the best counter arguments?
Well, why then? Let's go back to, can you speculate? Joe Cirincione was in Ottawa a couple of months ago, and he had sort of been involved with with Obama at the outset, and he claims that Obama really, really, really wanted to get rid of nuclear weapons, and just simply couldn't make it happen. But I didn't inquire too deeply into the history of the particular failure to get the, if you'll excuse the expression, no first use policy adopted. And it would be of interest, I think, to find out how they managed to block him. What were the arguments, or if not arguments, power maneuvers that somebody employed that were able to block him?
Yeah. Let's go back to the founding of NATO in the early 50s. Within a few years, NATO adopted a policy of using nuclear weapons first. Mm-hmm. Has not deviated from that policy since. So you have not just the U.S. position, but an alliance position that's kind of locked in. When Obama broached this idea, not just some of the NATO allies, but also Japan, believe it or not, said, wait a minute, we don't want a no first use policy by the United States. We feel conventionally threatened by China or Russia or North Korea. North Korea was a lesser issue at that time, but became an issue. And there developed a coordination between those in the United States who wanted to retain first use option and some of the allies. If this had been a public debate, I think there's no question that the mobilization could have occurred in many of the allies saying, yes, we want a no first use policy. We're absolutely in favor of that. But that didn't occur. There was another development which was and is troubling, which is that Russia, which had had a no first use policy as the Soviet Union, abandoned it, and in years has talked about this concept of escalating to de-escalate, nuclear escalation. In other words, initiating nuclear war with the hope that in fact that would shock everyone and they would stop in their tracks and so on and so forth. Which is a lot of wishful thinking, because in fact the policy of deterrence is if someone uses it, you use it back. And all of a sudden that's supposed to disappear. Well, maybe, maybe not. At any rate, Russia was heading more in that direction, and so it seemed odd for NATO to be going in the other direction. So this is where the coordination becomes so important. Parliamentarians for Nuclear Nonproliferation and Disarmament did some work in this area, and they were able to get a large group in the Japanese parliament to say, yes, we're in favor of no first use. But the government did not communicate that or pick up on that in its conversations with the US. Germany had already been burnt. Remember when Fischer was foreign minister? He tried to get NATO to adopt a no first use issue. Fischer. That was rejected, and so Germany wasn't about to jump in and make an issue of it again without popular support for that, which at that point didn't exist. So none of this is going to be easy.
How about let's get Canada working on it? I must say this is not something that is a conversation here, but Canada's in a very good position, I would think, as good a position as anybody if we just had some, intestinal fortitude.
I think your government needs to be asked, do you really think it's a good idea to start nuclear war?
We ask them some pertinent questions now and then. They don't give us very good answers.
I think it'd be interesting to see how they respond and to see how public opinion feel about such responses.
Well, it might.
This is going to need a little everywhere.
Let's play with this a second, because we're making no progress yet on getting Canada to change its mind and go ahead and sign the ban treaty, the TPNW. That's not happening, and I won't try to psych out the mentality of Justin Trudeau, but I don't see any movement in that direction. But if we keep pushing them for something, it might, one of the interesting things might be to say, well, first, how about doing this? If you won't do that, how about taking some initiative in NATO to have NATO declare I'm sorry if I use the word no first use, I can't think of your language, but that, if NATO took such a position, well, tell me what you would think about that.
It would be a fantastic breakthrough. It would put us in a position to ask Russia to reconsider its, option to initiate nuclear war. It would support China and India. It would be a wonderful affirmation of the consistency that they've shown on this policy. It would leave the question of Pakistan and Israel and North Korea. And those are tough nuts, but they also are minor compared to the major nuclear weapon states. I think there is a process underway which could handle the North Korean situation without going through a no first use issue. Israel is harder, but its conventional capacity is so strong that the only time it actually really behaved as if it was going to initiate nuclear war was in order to get the U.S. to resupply it during the Yom Kippur War, when it was initially losing some ground to Egypt, and some of its military supplies were running low, and basically they told Kissinger, if you don't send us more conventional weapons, we're going to have to resort to using our nuclear weapons.
But I didn't know that. Was this publicly known at the time? I never heard that before.
Not at the time, but since then it's come out. In fact, they even had worked out a plan for blowing up a nuclear weapon in the Sinai Peninsula so that the explosion would be visible from Cairo. And it would have involved, flying in a helicopter, planting the bomb, and then blowing it up. What's his name? Invar Cohen has written about this. Yeah, it's interesting stuff. But they haven't done any. They've never come anywhere near close to that kind of action since then. And since they deny the existence of their nuclear weapons anyway, it's not clear that how much weight they put to into actually initiating the use of nuclear weapons. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. It's a tricky issue with Israel, and it's extremely difficult to talk about when most of the nuclear weapon states do have first-use policies. And but if NATO were to come around on this, it would change the ground completely.
Well, okay. We're about 15 minutes overdue to finish this, and I can hardly bring myself to stop this conversation because it is very, very promising, I think. So but let's wind it up shortly. First of all, I want to get you committed to getting somebody to write a piece for Peace Magazine about this, and I promise I'll distribute it pretty widely, because I think it's a very interesting conversation to promote.
I'll take a look at some of the papers I've circulated with the Abolition 2000 Working Group and see if it could be made up to date and appropriate. Mm-hmm. Peace News.
Mm-hmm. Okay, yeah, Peace Magazine. Great. Okay, and we haven't even got to talking about Zona Libre, but I've got to finish off in a minute. Zona Libre seems to be you've founded a new group in Mexico City, and you're spending half your time administering that. Is that right? Do you want to say a word or two before we hang up?
We're a low bureaucracy operation. Basically, it's people who are in a position to take ideas to the Mexican Foreign Ministry, and when the opportunity arises, to other foreign ministries in Latin America. The main idea we're trying to take up now is this notion of first use.
Mm-hmm. Good for you. All right. Well, it's been fascinating, and I certainly give you all my blessings for the wonderful work you're doing. And it's such a pleasure to be back in touch with a dear friend. So Indeed. Carry on, Alan, and I'll send you the link to this video, and please share it as you like, because I think this is the kind of conversation that we should try to stimulate in a lot of circles that maybe I've not had quite this conversation with anybody about nuclear weapons for a while. And I'd like a whole bunch of people to watch this video and pass it on. Okay?
Okay.
So thank you so much, and bless your heart. Carry on. Okay. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.